This week in lab we'll be covering exercise 32, anatomy of blood vessels. Throughout this exercise, we'll examine the microscopic structure of blood vessels and identify the major arteries and veins of the systemic circuit. Blood vessels are the channels that carry blood throughout the body. Blood vessels include arteries, veins, capillaries, arterioles, and venules. Arteries carry blood away from the heart, while veins drain tissues and return blood back to the heart. Tiny capillaries connect arterioles and venules, directly serving the needs of the body's cells. Capillary walls are thin, allowing for the exchange of gases and nutrients to be made between tissue cells and blood. Except for the thin, microscopic capillaries, the walls of blood vessels are constructed of three coats, or tunics: the tunica intima, tunica media, and tunica externa. In general, the walls of arteries are thicker than those of veins. The tunica media tends to contain substantially more smooth muscle and elastic tissue. Different types of arteries have differing amounts of elastic tissue and smooth muscle, based on location and function. For example, elastic arteries like the aorta are closest to the pumping action of the heart, and contain more elastic tissue than other arteries. Elastic arteries must be able to expand and recoil as the heart pumps blood throughout the systemic circuit. On the other hand, veins don't experience as much pressure as arteries, and therefore have a thinner tunica media and a larger lumen than the corresponding artery. Veins also contain valves to prevent the backflow of blood. Capillaries allow for the exchange of materials, such as gases and nutrients, between the blood and tissue cells. Because of this, capillaries are microscopically thin, containing only a tunica intima composed of endothelial cells. The table in your lab book summarizes more details on blood vessel anatomy and function. Now we'll dive into the anatomy and identification of the major systemic blood vessels of the body. Remember that all arteries, apart from the pulmonary arteries, carry oxygenated blood away from the heart towards the rest of the body. Remember that the A in artery stands for away. All veins, apart from the pulmonary veins, carry deoxygenated blood from the tissues back to the heart. Let's begin by identifying the major systemic arteries of the body, beginning proximally near the heart and working our way distally towards the hands and feet. Please note that we will not be covering every blood vessel, but will highlight the major arteries and veins in the systemic circuit. Blood is pumped out of the left ventricle through the aortic valve and into the aorta, the largest artery of the body. This begins our journey throughout the systemic circuit. The aorta has three main regions: the ascending aorta, aortic arch, and the descending aorta. The descending aorta is identified as the descending thoracic aorta throughout the thoracic cavity. After it penetrates the diaphragm and enters the abdominal cavity, it is identified as the descending abdominal aorta. You may have noticed a trend with naming vessels. In many cases, the name of the artery or vein reflects the body region it travels through, the organ served, or the bone followed. Let's backtrack a bit and revisit the aortic arch and the subsequent pathway through the neck and arm. The brachiocephalic trunk is the first branch off the aortic arch. The second branch is the left common carotid artery, and the third is the left subclavian artery. Brachiocephalic translates to arm head, and the brachiocephalic trunk bifurcates, or forks, into the right subclavian artery leading to the arm, and the right common carotid artery leading to the head. The right and left common carotid arteries divide to form an internal and external carotid artery, providing oxygenated blood to the brain and superficial tissues of the skull. Many more arteries serve the brain, but we will not be discussing them in detail. Let's look again at the right and left subclavian arteries. Once the subclavian artery passes under the clavicle, it becomes the axillary artery at the first rib. Recall that the axillary region refers to the armpit. The axillary artery runs from the first rib to the inferior edge of the teres major muscle. At the inferior edge of the teres major, the axillary artery becomes the brachial artery as it enters the brachial region of the arm. At the elbow, the brachial artery divides into the radial and ulnar arteries, which follow the same named bones to supply the forearm and hand. Another notable artery is the internal thoracic artery. The right and left internal thoracic arteries arise from the subclavian arteries and supply the mammary glands, most of the thorax wall, and anterior intercostal structures. Let's move on to the arteries of the abdominal organs and lower limbs. Recall that the descending thoracic aorta becomes the descending abdominal aorta after crossing through the diaphragm. The descending abdominal aorta gives rise to several arteries that supply abdominal organs, with artery names often reflecting the organ served. Three main arteries branch off the anterior face of the descending abdominal aorta. Most superior is the celiac trunk, followed by the superior and inferior mesenteric arteries. Think of the celiac trunk as the trunk of a tree, giving rise to three branches: the left gastric artery, the splenic artery, and the common hepatic artery. Here's another view of the celiac trunk, along with the stomach, spleen, small intestine, and other organs. If you're in doubt of an artery's name, trace it to the organ served. The left gastric artery serves the superior portion of the stomach. The splenic artery serves the spleen, and the common hepatic artery heads towards the liver. The common hepatic artery becomes the proper hepatic artery, with the gastroduodenal artery branching off and supplying the inferior portion of the stomach and duodenum. In addition to the celiac trunk, superior mesenteric artery, and inferior mesenteric artery, there are many smaller arteries that arise from the descending abdominal aorta. A few notable arteries include the middle suprarenal or adrenal arteries and the inferior suprarenal or adrenal arteries. The renal arteries serve the kidneys, while the gonadal artery serves the testicles in men and ovaries in women. The descending abdominal aorta splits into the right and left common iliac arteries. The common iliac artery extends briefly before splitting into the internal and external iliac arteries. The external iliac artery then becomes the common femoral artery at the inguinal ligament. The common femoral artery quickly gives rise to the deep femoral artery, and the superficial femoral artery, which also continues down the thigh. At the knee, the superficial femoral artery pops out through the adductor hiatus to become the popliteal artery, passing behind the knee. Here's a posterior view of the popliteal artery. The popliteal artery splits into the anterior tibial artery, traveling along the front of the tibia, and the posterior tibial artery, tracing the posterior face of the tibia. The fibular artery quickly branches off the posterior tibial artery. These arteries continue to subdivide, supplying blood to the leg, ankle, and foot. Let's take a look at the posterior view. Again, the popliteal artery splits into the anterior tibial artery and the posterior tibial artery. The fibular artery quickly branches off the posterior tibial artery. Arteries are generally located in deep, well-protected areas of the body. However, many veins follow a more superficial course and are often easily seen and palpated. Many deep veins parallel the course of major arteries, often with identical names. Veins draining the head and upper extremities empty deoxygenated blood into the superior vena cava, while those draining the lower body empty into the inferior vena cava. After emptying deoxygenated blood into the superior and inferior vena cava, the blood enters the right atrium of the heart and travels through the pulmonary circuit, becoming oxygenated before exiting through the aorta. We're taking a very brief look at the major veins within the body. Keep in mind that there are countless more that we will not be able to cover in lab. Within the leg, the great saphenous vein, the longest vein in the body, and femoral vein meet at the saphenous femoral junction. The femoral vein continues up the leg, running parallel to the common femoral artery. The femoral vein passes the inguinal ligament, eventually becoming the external iliac vein. The external and internal iliac veins unite to form the common iliac vein. The right and left common iliac veins drain blood from the legs and pelvis into the inferior vena cava. Moving superiorly in the abdominal cavity, the inferior vena cava receives blood from the ovary or testes via the gonadal veins, from the kidneys via the paired renal veins, and the adrenal glands via the adrenal veins. The hepatic veins drain the liver. Keep in mind that the inferior vena cava is much longer than the superior vena cava and returns blood to the heart from all body regions below the diaphragm. The superior vena cava, on the other hand, receives blood from the veins of the head and upper extremities. The right and left brachiocephalic veins unite to form the superior vena cava. Notice that although there is only one brachiocephalic artery, there are two brachiocephalic veins. The paired subclavian veins and internal jugular veins branch from the brachiocephalic veins. The external jugular vein joins the subclavian vein near its origin. After the superior and inferior vena cava empty blood into the right atrium, the blood follows the pulmonary circuit. Recall from previous labs that the pulmonary circulation differs in many ways from the systemic circulation. It functions to bring blood into close contact with the alveoli of the lungs to permit gas exchange, ridding blood of excess carbon dioxide and replenishing its supply of oxygen. This oxygenated blood is then pumped out through the aorta to the rest of the body. Be sure to read through exercise 32 before coming to lab. Bring the blood vessel study list to lab with you. This list is found on Canvas, and you will only be responsible for knowing the vessels included on this list. Take your online Canvas quiz the day before your scheduled lab, and as always, reach out to your lab professor with any questions or concerns.